That's it for announcements. All right, let's get down to the business of the building of Inwood, real estate speculation and urban planning in Upper Manhattan. We're starting way back. Turn up or down? Okay. I think I can do that. Like, that's probably louder now, right? Oh, beautiful. All right. All right, before the Dutch, before the city, there was the Lenape. And if a lot of these blue dots, you can see that the Lenape lived, ate, all over the neighborhood. And this is where Lenape artifacts have been found. Different sites for different uses. We can see fishing, footpaths across the original route of Broadway, fresh water and springs, shelter, cultivated crops even, the wading place, which is the place where you could wade onto New York State from Manhattan at low tide, fishing at Tubby Hook and at Sherman Creek. All over the neighborhood, people have found arrowheads, storage vessels, and other tools. No one knows how many Lenape people lived here, but they lived here starting 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, probably. So thousands of years of living in Inwood and having communities in Inwood. That all started to change in 1609 when Henry Hudson arrived in Spuyten Duyvil around September 13th. And in the diary of his first mate, was recorded that 4 canoes of Lenape residents came with oysters to meet the ship. Most of the meetings were not friendly and did not go well, but that is the date, September 13th, when the Dutch first arrived. We're going to cover a lot of ground quickly because we're going to go up into the built environment of the city, but we want to show the background. Everyone has heard the story of the Shotgun Brief, although you may not have heard it as the Shotgun Brief. It's when Peter Minuit purchased the island of Mannahattas from the Indians for a value of 60 guilders, and that is the quote from the business letter that Peter Shotgun sent back to the main office in Holland in November of 1626. That is the only documentation of this transaction. It did not take place at Shirakapak. There is a plaque at Shirakapak saying that it took place there. That was put up by the Peter Minuit Post of real estate professionals, but in 1995, one of the old timers at the Peter Minuit Post said to the New York Times, quote, "I don't know why the hell we put the plaque up in Inwood," unquote. Permanent settlement of Manhattan by the Dutch West India Company began in 1625, and the Dutch did use violence to evict the Lenape people, especially Director Willem Kieft. He dashed New Amsterdam's chances of peaceful coexistence. He demanded tributes for protection. That's almost like getting mobbed up. 1642 to 1645 was Kieft's war, bloody attacks against the Lenape. And then in 1647, the Dutch West India Company had had enough of him, and they fired him. And replaced by Peter Stuyvesant, Kieft died in a shipwreck on the way back to Holland, I think. And then in 1655, the short and brutal Peachtree War. And that was enough for the Lenape. There were a few instances of them living up here, but most of them had to move, and have moved and moved and moved, and now live in Oklahoma and Canada. In the mid-1600s, we start to get farmers up here. Land grants were made by Dutch West India Company Director Kieft, and in Inwood, he gave land to Jansen and Artson and a different Jansen, Matthias, in 1646 and 1647. Jansen and Artson didn't live up here. They hired a farmer to develop the land, Tobias Tennyson. This is part one he was the first Dutch farmer, to live in Inwood. He was killed in 1655. Not by the Lenape, but by a different group of Native Americans who had a beef with New Amsterdam. And his family was taken hostage. So at that point, 1656, further uptown settlement was discouraged, and farms were abandoned. Tennyson's family refused to return, which opens the door in 1677 for Jan Dijkman, and Jan Nagel. Harlem residents, Vermilia and Bosch, were also awarded land. This was a land grant by the town of New Harlem. And Dyckman and Nagel bought out the other people who had been granted land, and pretty much together occupied or took the land at the top of Manhattan Island. They didn't want to live up here yet, so they leased their land to a couple of farmers, Hendrik Kierson and Michael Bastianson. They leased their land for 12 years. This is a famous lease, New York real estate lease. The lease expired after the 1689 harvest, and for the first 7 years, Kierson and Bastianson each paid a rent of 1 hen per year, gradually rising to 200 guilders apiece per year in cash later. And they agreed to construct buildings and fences and otherwise improve the land, and in return, Dyckman and Nagel agreed to plant an orchard for them of at least 50 apple or pear trees. So then at the end, Bastianson and Kierson would leave, and Dyckman and Nagel would come, and they would have ready-made farms, already built, already improved, already productive, for them to start using. What happened was that Nagel died before the lease was up, and Dyckman's wife died before the lease was up. So in the true kind of business relationship and maybe love, Dyckman married Nagel's widow. Got married up here in Inwood, combined their land into the gigantic Dyckman land, and even had another family, and began farming for real up here. When they moved up here in 1690, there was no road. The road didn't exist until about 1707 when it was surveyed and laid out. The very first Broadway, which was known as the road to King's Bridge, came up the path of Broadway to Dyckman Street and then veered over towards the Harlem River, where Dyckman and Nagel had their homes. This was a swampy area. Sherman Creek came in very far. This swampy area and all the way to King's Bridge, which was now the land route onto the island of Manhattan. So the first road, the King's Bridge, was built in the, I think, 1690s at first. Now we're going to jump ahead 100 years to the first apartment built, well, not the first apartment buildings, but the first huts built into the Inwood hillsides. The first housing projects in Inwood were during the Revolutionary War, when British and German mercenary soldiers built huts into the side of Inwood Hill and in other places in the neighborhood, hundreds of huts. They know this because they excavated at least 70 or 75 of them in the early 1900s along Payson Avenue. And that's what this is an image of, Payson Avenue, Seaman Avenue, and these are the apartment buildings along Seaman Avenue and the houses pretty much along Payson. And so underneath them all were these huts made to military specifications. In the back of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, there is a reproduction of one of these huts, but that does have an original fireplace in it that was moved from Payson Avenue. So this is the first time that hundreds of people had lived here and in multiple occupancy buildings. Like 6 to 8 soldiers might have lived in each of these huts. The postwar farming community, Inwood's population is very stable, of around 100, 125 people. Dyckman Farmhouse, this is from 1819. This is Broadway, called Kingbridge Road, 204th Street, and Cooper Street. The Dyckman Farmhouse hasn't moved, it's still there. You can see that it also had a stable and barn, but these are apartment buildings now. A cider mill right at the corner. And what were they growing up here? In 1855, Isaac and Michael Dyckman reported on 93 acres of land, they were growing 16 acres of corn, 4 acres of potatoes, an acre of turnips. They harvested 18 tons of hay, 125 bushels of onions, and they had 10 acres of improved pasture land for grazing livestock. Before that, stuff was happening downtown. The population, look at that population on the left. In 1800, Manhattan's population was 60,000. But in 1840, it had gone up 5 times to 312,000. So a commission was appointed in 1807 to survey and plan the street layout for this largely undeveloped island up here. This is where the city was, all like down below 14th Street. So they were going to survey and make roads for the entire island, except they decided not to. They must have been drinking or something, because they decided they just didn't get around to anything above 155th Street. And in their final report, they explained their reasoning. To some, it may be a matter of surprise that the whole island has not been laid out as a city. But we think it's improbable that for centuries to come, the grounds north of the Harlem Flat will be covered with houses. Oops. So there was it was still the Wild West up here in terms of roads. They had decided how far apart a street could be and how far apart the avenues would be. Street, how many feet, how many yards. And so you could survey all the way to the top of the island. It's just that none of this was official, this grid that you see here. It's all unofficial. It's just extrapolations. In 1835, I guess you could call him the first gentrifier, arrived in Inwood. Samuel Thompson, he wanted to build a country home here. He bought some land on top of Inwood Hill from the Dykeman brothers and built a mansion. It caught fire as soon as he was ready to move in, so he built it twice. And he was a builder, contractor, architect, and he talked up the neighborhood. His sons were real estate developers in Inwood. While in Inwood, I believe, he suffered a stroke at a building site, and he died 6 months later. His house was demolished later in 1889 to make room for the House of Mercy, which we'll talk about briefly later. So he was the first. He also built the first church at today's corner of Dykeman, Riverside, and Broadway, Mount Washington Presbyterian. Mount Washington Presbyterian Church still exists on Vermilion in a different building. But this is what it looked like. Imagine you're looking at the Ring Garden or something like that. And this would be the playground, and this would be the intersection of Dykeman and Broadway. Some of the early buildings were derided by neighborhood residents as just too much. They even gave them nicknames. The first grammar school, School 52, this was at the corner of Academy Street and Broadway up until the 1950s, I think. It was called McKeon's Folly because the growth of Tubby Hook was it had been opened in 1858, but the neighborhood grew so slowly that only the first floor was used. And school commissioner James McKeon, he was the motivating force behind getting it built. And it was long thought known as McKeon's Folly. It was like, what was he thinking? No one's ever going to live up there. The commissioners themselves said it would be hundreds of years. Another person who built a mansion up here, John T. Seaman, there's an arch on Broadway that's still left over from this estate. Newspapers called his home, his marble home, his extravagant marble mansion, they called it Seaman's Folly. So we had McKeon's Folly and Seaman's Folly, because why would you ever spend that much money on a mansion that no one's ever going to see, because no one lives there? And why would you build a school so big when no one's ever going to go to school there? But they may have had some things that they knew that or maybe they were just lucky. In September of 1849, the first railroad passed by our neighborhood, passed through it at Tubby Hook, right on the Hudson River at Dykeman Street. This is the train station, the Tubby Hook station. The Hudson River Railroad opened for business from New York City to Peekskill, and it provided residents with regular service downtown, meaning they could live here and work downtown. It also made it accessible for weekenders downtown to come up to Inwood. That was going to be a game changer for a while. And one of the things that train station fueled was the first land speculation. And Andrew Haswell Green in 1866 wrote kind of a complaint. A lines of streets that don't exist. These are just extrapolations. Lines of streets that do not exist above 155th Street are continually used as boundaries of the transfers of land. And he was using this as an argument to finish the layout and get it done so that surveyors could actually survey properties correctly so that they could be bought and sold. Meanwhile, a bunch of people followed in Samuel Thompson's footsteps. As soon as the railroad opened, at least 15 mansions were built on top of, just on the western view side of Inwood Hill alone. So the first building boom in Inwood was country estates in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. One of the Brooks brothers lived up here. One of the partners at Macy's, Isidore Straus, lived up here. One of the publishers of Puck Magazine lived up here. In 1859, Inwood had its first big land auction. And the layout of the streets hadn't yet been approved by the city, but the developer used them anyway and just used the extrapolated streets to sell the land between 211th and 216th Street between Broadway and 10th Avenue. Many of the lots didn't sell. They were offered for sale again the following year. A first shot at a post office. This is a neighborhood name that didn't stick. We could have been Kingsbridge Park. How about that for a name? In 1863, a new local post office branch was named the Kingsbridge Park Station, and it was in this grocery store at Tubby Hook, right on the Hudson River. In 1863, a word we all know is born. Inwood was used on a real estate map to help attract speculators. So Inwood is a real estate term. And here's the map at the New York Register's office. George S. Thompson. Let's take a look at it all. Dated January 1st, 1863. This is Dyckman Street, called Hudson Avenue, to the Hudson River. And that's Kingsbridge Road, that's Broadway. So Broadway, Dyckman Street, yeah, so this is Tubby Hook. They're not calling it Tubby Hook because they didn't like the name of it. They didn't think it would sell. They thought Inwood kind of sounded like foresty, shady glades, kind of countryside, little country, a little rock and roll. They thought it had a nice ring to it, so they used it. And so this was in 1863, the second auction. And I don't know if that auction was a popular auction, but it persuaded the railroad to change the name of the train station. And the next year, 1864, the railroad station at Tubby Hook was renamed Inwood. And it has been Inwood ever since. This whole thing about the roads, though, not being laid out above 155th Street was causing land speculators and even just people who lived in the neighborhood, it was kind of annoying. So the city appointed commissioners of Central Park who had been working on Central Park. They thought, you guys did such a great job with Central Park, why don't you just keep working on this new project, the street layout of Upper Manhattan? And Andrew H. Green became the sort of voice of that group. And for about 5 years, they were responsible for laying out North Manhattan streets, and they did. And the way they laid out the streets is pretty much the way they are today. Here's a snapshot of what they were facing when they started working on it. North of 155th Street is about 1,700 acres. There were about 4,000 people there. There were about 250 landowners, 350 houses. 120 homes were like right in the middle of intersections and would probably have to be torn down. And about 400 acres belonged to the single biggest landowner, Isaac Dyckman. The challenge was the varied topography. Fort Tryon, Inwood Hill, Washington Heights, steep hills going up and down, up to the highest point in Manhattan, 271 feet. And at that point, in 1865, it was still easier to commute to Tarrytown than to North Manhattan. There were only a couple trains a day. North Manhattan was a playground for the rich. the exceeding picturesqueness of this part of the island have rendered it a favorite resort of much of the wealth and intelligence of the city. That's kind of insulting. But it was a place for country homes. Andrew Green proposed a couple of things. A grid that was sensitive to the topography of the upper end of the island. And so to do this, Dykeman Street was laid out independently of the downtown grid, with local streets aligned to it. So there's a bend in Dykeman Street. Dykeman Street is going at one angle from Tubby Hook to Broadway and at a different angle from Broadway to the Harlem River. And that was so the grid could make a turn. You can see this is the grid that goes all the way downtown, right angles, north, south, east, west, cardinal directions. But when you get to Nagle Avenue, the grid shifts. And that's so that you could still have a grid with right-angled corners, but go between the hillsides, between Washington Heights or Fort George, between Inwood Hill Park. And in order to make crosstown traffic a little easier, he proposed making a lot more north-south avenues. So he decided on Payson Avenue, Seaman Avenue, Vermilion Avenue, Sherman Avenue, and Post Avenue. Kind of ingenious. It took a while for him to actually do this, so land speculators were selling anyway. 1859, we talked about this was all sold before the grid was laid out. 1863, this was sold before the grid was finalized. 1866, the top of the island, this hilly part of Inwood Hill, was sold before the grid was laid out. It turns out there wasn't going to be many streets up there anyway. And what he did over a period of 5 years was this. In 1866, he laid out Dykeman Street. In 1867, he finalized the route of Broadway. In 1868, he laid out the streets below Dykeman from Nagle up. And in 1869, he laid out everything else. And this was good because Isaac Dykeman had just died. I mean, that's not good. But his heirs wanted to sell off the land. This was the end of the Dykeman real estate ownership. And so in 1868, they sold this right after Nagle had been laid out. And then they petitioned, in 1869, they petitioned Andrew Green, can you hurry up, please? We have all this other land that we want to sell. And so he said, votre service. And in 1869, he laid out the rest, including 207th Street, the two business districts, where Dykeman would be Dykeman Street and 207th Street. They could be the commercial centers of the neighborhood. And here, the last of the Dykeman auctions. There were, I think, 5. We'll see a map soon. Here we can see 4 Dykeman auctions, and in the 4th Dykeman auction in 1871, the Dykeman farmhouse was sold also. And then it became a rental property. So this is what it looked like from 1859 to 1871. It's about 12 years, 13 years. Is that half of the land that in Inwood was sold? The Dykemans kept this. John Seaman had his Seaman's Folly. The Ishams had their estate. And the mansions were still there. But all of the flat lands, all of the easier land to develop was sold. One of the things that they did that was sort of smart, the Central Park Commission thought, hey, what about green space? Should we save any? And in 1872, this map shows that they've saved Fort Washington and a little bit of Highbridge Park. All right, we're getting up to the 20th century. All this sort of came to a grinding halt in 1871 when Grand Central Station opened and started rerouting the trains up the Bronx side instead of up the Upper West Side. So suddenly, the train service to Inwood became irregular, unpredictable, and fewer trains. So if you're a wealthy person with a country home and you can't get up there, you're pretty ticked off, and you might just say, I'm just going to leave. And that is largely what happened. The homes atop of Inwood Hill were mostly deserted after 1871. And Inwood's population shrank. Here's the pastor at Mount Washington Presbyterian, what he said. He said after 1871, suddenly these beautiful homes were one by one deserted, and one of the fairest regions in the state became in a few years a veritable wilderness. Instead of a natural increase of the population, there was a decrease. The place became a wilderness, isolated from the rest of the city. There was no post office anymore, no telegraph station, no telephone, no electric light. The nearest drugstore, the nearest market, and the nearest doctor were 2 or 3 miles away, probably up in Kingsbridge or down in Washington Heights. The city still kind of thought that this was going to grow. This neighborhood had potential. So they started street improvements. Here's a map from 1874 of street drains and sewers along Dyckman Street, which was the main drag of this neighborhood, being installed. So storm drains were being put in slowly. No paving of streets. Very few streets were actually laid out. But some of the infrastructure was being put into place. And in 1876, the landowners were being billed, sent assessments for infrastructure improvements. Here's Isaac Dyckman being assessed $60,000 in order for them to improve the streets along his property. That must have been like hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. Maybe crazy. And paving of Broadway began in 1882. It reached our neighborhood in the 1890s. It would reach Inwood within about 10 years. So this is the reports of Public Works, the City of New York. You can look it all up. It's kind of dry reading, but it's interesting because that's how much cubic yards of building material are used for a bridge over Dyckman's Creek, Farmers Bridge Road, et cetera, et cetera. What was going on with the population leaving was that institutions were snapping up the property atop Inwood Hill that had previously been country homes. These Victorian institutions, Dickensian, Inwood Hill became a dumping ground basically for society's outcasts. The House of Mercy on the Samuel Thompson site for alcohol and drug addiction treatment of destitute and fallen women. That's the House of Mercy's words. The Magdalene Benevolent Society, treatment for, and again in their own words, chastity offenders and erring females. And the House of Rest for consumptives for advanced tuberculosis patients. Jeez. Yeah, most people checked in but didn't check out. It turned out that Inwood Hill's weather was not really therapeutic for tuberculosis patients. And in 1895, some of the biggest geography change of our neighborhood, Marble Hill was separated from Inwood to prepare the Harlem River for commercial shipping traffic. And it was finished in 1936. This is where the Broadway Bridge is now. It was just a marble cutting canal that was driven by the tides to saw chunks of stone. And in 1895, the first Broadway Bridge right through the canal that they had just built to separate Marble Hill from Manhattan. This bridge only lasted 12 or 13 years before the subway arrived, and then it had to be rebuilt. But the first public transportation to arrive was not the subway, it was a trolley line. In 1900, 1904, this is the Reverend again talking. The Broadway trolley line was laid through Inwood to Kingsbridge in 1900, and then for the first time, the moribund real estate of Inwood began to show signs of life and slowly to bestir itself. And all right, well, that's kind of florid, but it's an understatement. Because by 1903, it was all over the news. Rapid transit, more rapid transit on the horizon, meaning the IRT. New York Herald in 1902, this is before the trains even get there. Rapid transit expected to create a new boom in the Dyckman tract. Speculative rise in the section 30 years ago was not backed by the logic. So the previous building booms did not pay off for investors. Everyone's hoping this is the time they can take home the change. Washington Heights, a theater of speculation. Dyckman tracks future development because of the subway's northerly link now makes it accessible. Rapid transit's on its way. Here's the trains arrive in March of 1906. And here's this headline, "The Modern Magic May Build a City in a Night at the northern end of Manhattan." And in March of 1906, this is what the neighborhood looked like. They built a train and the neighborhood followed the train. So the IRT opened for intermittent service across Inwood's mostly unbuilt landscape. Here it is, March 9th. This is the week before the trains opened. So the trains opened and stuff was still being built. So we're looking north from the Dyckman station. There's the powerhouses at 215th Street. And this is in the University Heights in the Bronx. That's a real estate developers started to advertise their prospective and under construction buildings. Here in 1904 is a pre-announcement of Inwood's first apartment buildings. The Solano and Moneta, they still stand just east of Broadway on Dyckman Street. Here they are just after they've been built, all by their lonesome. So this would be Vermilion. Is this Vermilion? Yeah, maybe. It must be. Yeah. So I took this ad out of a full page of ads for brand new Washington Heights apartments from 1906. Oh my God. So this whole page is new buildings being built in Washington Heights and Inwood. I think that actually this is the only building in Inwood. The rest are for Washington Heights. So we're talking about a development of Inwood, but we're really talking about the bigger picture. We're talking about everything above 155th Street was every place where the subway had opened a station was subject to development. Love this, 2 million in apartments for the Dyckman district. Builders are busy adding 32 new 5-story flats in 1915. So the whole neighborhood was under construction and just gaining steam. Here's a picture from the New York Times real estate section. Has the old Dyckman house, that was still there, but all these other apartment buildings recently finished on 205th Street east of Broadway, the Solano apartments with the Moneta, Dyckman east of Broadway, row of buildings under construction, Hazelwood Court on Post Avenue and 207th. A real estate feeding frenzy finally materializes after many false starts in the 1800s. So Dyckman is the haven for low rent payers. It's designed as a low-rise apartments, 5 and 6-story buildings built for blue-collar workers and something they called strivers, a type of person, someone who is striving to better themselves. So blue-collar workers and strivers. These apartments were built for. And because you could take the number 1 train there, you could get downtown in 45 minutes, in half an hour to the Upper West Side, wherever you were working. It just changed the whole game. It took a while for some things to happen when the roads were being built. The code for road building was that you couldn't be too steep, and so the road couldn't go below water level, obviously, if it was swampy. It also couldn't go uphill too steeply either. So the road grades were specified, and so in order to keep the streets flat, sometimes they dynamited below the level of the bedrock. Here we are at 204th and Post. So there's still a couple examples of this kind of rock outcrop in our neighborhood. Here's Arden Street being plowed right through a hill, and the or a mountain of rubble ready to be shipped away. And there's Broadway. This is the Mount Washington Church at the intersection of Dyckman in 1912. 1915, 207th and Broadway. Streetcar. We can see the neighborhood is 1/3 built or something. The neighborhood was built very, very quickly. And on the southwest corner of 207th Street, we can see the marble rock outcrop there. That's no longer there, but that's like 10 or 15 feet. That's probably the height that the Dykeman's house is on now. Yeah. And of course, with apartment buildings, some schools were built. We saw McKeon's Folly, Grammar School 52. They added a huge addition to Grammar School 52. I guess McKeon had the last laugh. And parks. Inwood's first park, Isham Park, was dedicated in 1912. All of this is happening between the opening of the subway in 1906 and the first 10 years. So much is happening. Isham Park celebration. During the Isham Park celebration, Borough President George McEnany tried to humiliate the landowners into giving more land for parks to the city. And he was talking specifically about the landowners at the top of Inwood Hill. So the dedication of Isham Park also was something that caused or maybe have influenced landowners to give even more land to the city, sort of like in a domino effect. And in 1926, the city started acquiring land for Inwood Hill Park in 1916. You can see all these different parcels that they bought, different colors. And by 1926, they had assembled it all, and they opened it with a great ceremony and an Indian Day celebration, May 8th, 1926, right by the Shirakapak Rocket, where it wasn't there then, but right around there. So we'll see a few photos of a construction zone that was just happening nonstop through the neighborhood. Oh, yeah, let's go back. So this is Broadway. This is actually in preparation for the A train, because that's being dug underneath. And there's the Dykeman Farmhouse. This is landfill from the A train construction that ended up leveling out the baseball fields. They call it Isham Park, but Isham Park and Inwood Park kind of combined in the ball field area. Isham Park was from the top of the hill down to the water. So this photo is called Isham Park Dump. They're just dumping landfill to make the park, I guess, better. Yeah, for allow baseball to be played. This photo is 1926. Yeah. Robert Moses is not till the 30s, so this is before him. Yeah. I mean, he was around in the 20s, but he wasn't doing this yet. Yeah. Okay, this is stuff I'm going to skip except for a quick mention, but it's all important. An infrastructure timeline. Different bridges, Broadway Bridge, 207th Street Bridge, George Washington Bridge, Henry Hudson Bridge, and then the main arteries of roads, the Harlem Speedway, the Harlem River Drive. So that's the carification. The Harlem Speedway was open for horses. The Harlem River Drive covers much of the same territory, but for automobiles, and then Henry Hudson Parkway on the west side, or the West Side Highway in 1937. Then streetcars, Dykeman Street Ferry in 1915. 1948, the streetcars were replaced by buses. NYPD in 1874 opened a sub-precinct. Running water in 1875. Con Ed in 1899. Fire department in 1915. Finally, a regular post office in 1920. The library in 1922, a hospital in 1923, and the train yard at 207th Street in 1933. Street lights were first gas. Around 1890 they got here, and electric in 1915. How did Inwood change in 3 decades? 1912, we could see this. A lot has already happened since 1906. This is from Sanford Gaster's dissertation. 1921, we can see twice as much. And in 1930, the neighborhood is getting built there. It's getting built. It seems to be mostly, the southern part of the neighborhood seems to be mostly built. And actually, by the 40s, the neighborhood, almost all the building stock in the neighborhood was built. 1932, the 207th Street A train station opens. And that leads to even more development west of Broadway. Baker Field, 1922, dedicated in 1922, the football stadium opened. This one's the big stadium, but this is the old stadium made of wood. There's a new stadium now from the 80s. And this is right before Robert Moses, 1928 landfill adding to the parks. This is more from the A-train rubble being dug out, cut and cover, and also from street improvements, grading. They added 9.5 acres for the ball fields along the Hudson River in Inwood Hill Park. So we pretty much have a built neighborhood now. I just wanted to put this redlining slide in. We could see this was a real estate lending map, and so your interest rates would be higher, or maybe you couldn't even get a loan if you lived down in Harlem. The first grade of apartment stock, meaning maybe the whitest neighborhood, would have been here, Port Tryon. The second grade neighborhood was Inwood. Third grade is Washington Heights. Fourth grade is Lower Washington Heights and Harlem. So we've reached the peak. Believe it or not, we've almost reached the peak of Inwood's population in the 1940s. Families were bigger, and the neighborhood was mostly full. There was still one farm. The Benedettos, they held out until the 1950s. The last farm, Broadway at 213th Street. Let's take a look at how the population rocketed. The initial construction of Inwood from 1915 to 1940. In 1915, this is mostly census data from these tracts. I just add them up. 7,000, 14,000, 38,000, 50,000. So 7 times more people. It increased sevenfold. Is that math right? And then by 1950, up to 53,000. And then a little fade off as the demographics change and recover into the 90s and 2000s. 2020 census has a big dip in population, and that could be attributed to the pandemic and underreporting. One thing that's happening, however, is that household size in 1910, the average household had 4.5 people, according to the census, and in 2020, the average household has 3.25 people. So there's more than one person fewer per house. So if Inwood has 10,000 apartments in it, that means there are 10,000 fewer people today than there were in a full neighborhood in 1915, just because of the smaller families. A couple of, here's the main demographic change that happened. The Germans, who were largely Jewish, peaked in 1960. The Irish peaked in 1950s. And those populations, as they moved to the suburbs, were replaced by Hispanic, mostly from the Dominican Republic. So we could see the percentage of population is about 75% Dominican. All right. Now we're going to talk about the modern story of Inwood's built environment. Public housing, 1951, the Dyckman houses are open for business, 1,167 units in 7 buildings. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar grew up here. There's even talk now in 2021 and mentioned in 2023 of adding another small building into this. I don't know if it will happen, but there has been talk. The Nagel House, completed in 1964. Nagel at 204th. The Caroline, Sherman Avenue between 207 and 204th, completed in 1992. Most recent public housing. And now we'll see the beginning of the building boom that we all see happening now. Co-ops started to happen in the mid-'70s. One of the first apartments was close to here, Park Terrace Gardens. At first, only 5% of the apartments were spoken for, only 8 tenants bought. And that was probably because at first they were converting under an eviction plan, meaning that if you didn't buy, you could be evicted at the end of your lease. And so nobody bought. So Rose Associates sold the property to Two Trees, which converted the complex in 1975 into a non-eviction plan, according to this New York Times article, and then Two Trees sold about 250 apartments. So I guess what we're seeing is people trying to figure out how to do co-ops. Eviction plans today require 51% of the renters to purchase their units, but for a non-eviction plan, only 15% have to. So it was very successful to try a second time at Park Terrace Gardens. So were neighborhood people talking about this at the time? Turns out they were. Here's a flyer from a lecture by Inwood historian at the time, Michael Cohn. He was a lot like Cole and I, in that he gave history talks at the Cornerstone Center. And here's his talk on October 9th, 1984. New people, new housing. Conversion to co-ops have increased the stakes in neighborhood preservation. At the same time, residents, musicians, young singles, and new nationalities have moved into Washington Heights. That was all just a prelude to what happened in 2006, when the Department of City Planning proposed to rezone much of Sherman Creek, allowing residential buildings in waterfront plots, now zoned for manufacturing, to be rezoned as residential at higher heights. So the rezoning law would allow developers to construct bulkier buildings in agreeing to charge affordable rents on 20% of the apartments. Martin Collins was quoted as saying, "It's a plan that expedites gentrification," as the chairman of Community Board 12. This was just the beginning of this story. But before we get to it, in 2008, the first condo arrives in Manhattan at Seaman and Payson, a luxury condominium. It was billed in its promotional literature. And here the New York Times says that Inwood, at Manhattan's northernmost tip, may have a 202 area code, but that's about all it has in common with the rest of the borough. But a similarity to Manhattan is cropped up in the form of a new luxury condo, which several brokers identified as the first of a kind in Inwood, called Noma 175. It had 12 units with quartz countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a whirlpool tub. "Buyers up here are looking for condos," said the Douglas Elliman representative. But what was really the most important news was saved for the last paragraph. What could have a larger impact, however, is the planned rezoning of 30 blocks. So how did that story happen? We're going to have to generalize, because there's so much that you could say. So we'll just talk about the big points. This is something that de Blasio was a proponent of, and Bloomberg a little before that. New York City underwent immense change during the Bloomberg years. Few developers, however, opted to include the affordable units that Bloomberg was proposing, despite tax incentives. Only about 13% of the units were affordable housing. So an official involved in the recent discussions were saying that planners were considering for rezoning a stretch of Inwood along the Harlem River for a higher density of apartment buildings. And in 2016, we're going to jump ahead now, the rezoning is going full steam, but it hasn't passed anything yet. And everyone at that time thought that, and I guess Ydanis Rodriguez was in favor of it, but on August 15th, he came out opposed of the rezoning. He says that he's heard the community opposition, has changed his position, and now plans to vote no on a proposed 17-story, 350 development along Fort Tryon Park, where the old auto dealership used to be. He said, "We have not been able to get to the point where I feel it's in the community's interest to move this forward. I will not be supporting the rezoning." So that happened. urban planner Samuel Stein put the issues into perspective. Healthy cities exist in a state of flux. Change is necessary and good. A city that never changes is probably not a city at all. But a particular kind of change is taking hold in many cities and towns around the world, one that presents itself as neighborhood revitalization, but results in physical displacement and social disruption for the urban working class. In 2017, a revised rezoning was proposed. It was revised again, and here we can see the bluish green were potentially for development, and the red were already had people wanting to develop this land. They had this place called a commercial U between 207th Broadway and Dyckman Street. That was also going to be rezoned, but in 2018, on August 2nd of 2018, the city council modified the rezoning proposal to take this out and just really have it be here and the block with the library. I might as well just read the quote. On August 2nd, the city council modified the rezoning proposal in response to community concerns regarding small business and residential displacement within the commercial U, Dyckman Street, Broadway, 207th, and removed the proposed upzoning in this area with the exception of the Inwood Library block. Taking that out of the equation seemed to change the minds of some of the city council people who had voted no, because within a week, it was in danger of passing. The new zoning was probably going to pass. So the New York Times says the new zoning would dramatically reshape the largely industrial area east of 10th Avenue. It allows for buildings between 18 and 30 stories tall. There have been protests, there were a lot of protests as the city council vote approaches, including a sleep-in last week at the district office of Adonis Rodriguez, who supports the plan. One protester was arrested. It's not over until it's over, said Nova Lucero, and who is the lead organizer for Manhattan. Northern Manhattan is not for sale. But on August 8th, City Council approved the rezoning after the commercial U was taken out. After 3 years of planning, meetings, and protests, the City Council overwhelmingly approved a plan on Wednesday to rezone a large swath of Inwood, often referred to as the last affordable neighborhood in Manhattan. The approval of the Inwood neighborhood rezoning means a fairer, this is what de Blasio says, means a fairer, stronger future for the community that has experienced decades of disinvestment, Mr. de Blasio said. It means affordability, security, and the opportunity for residents and new immigrants alike. But a coalition of Inwood residents have opposed the plan because they fear that even with new affordable units, the influx of market rate apartments will increase rents and displace long-term residents. Esbiot called it a blueprint for gentrification at its finest. I am deeply concerned following last week's decision by the New York City Council to approve the plan to rezone Inwood, a plan that will have long-term devastating impact on the future of the community by potentially uprooting residents, families, and family-owned businesses that call Inwood home. And so the plan was appealed to the courts. And in 2019, a judge nixed the plan. Supreme Court Judge Verna Saunders annulled this council's August 2018 approval of the neighborhood zoning plan, and the zoning plan had set off a firestorm in the community. The judge sided with local residents who sued, contending that the prior environmental review of the project ignored concerns they'd raised. And so the judge sent the matter back to the Office of Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development to study the issues raised by the coalition, Unified Inwood. So the decision required the city to reboot the neighborhood review with the consideration of local concerns. 2019. And in 2021, the city appealed, and in 2021, the decision was overturned and rezoning was back. In July 2020, the Appellate Division of the New York Supreme Court reversed Judge Saunders' decision. And a last-ditch effort to have the state's Court of Appeals settle that matter was unsuccessful. So that meant that rezoning was on its way. And a couple of thoughts afterwards, the Inwood Legal Action Facebook group said that the argument of the activist group Northern Manhattan is not for sale was that they were just a bunch of disgruntled NIMBYists is false. We pushed for development that would better meet the needs of our community. We submitted an alternate plan calling for Inwood affordable housing, among other benefits, and we asked the city to analyze the impact of its plans on Asian, Black, and Latinx households. And Maggie Clark on the Inwood Preservation Facebook group, founder of it, said that added a little extra details. The environmental impact statement clearly showed that if the development went ahead, there would be 20 and 30-story buildings built. Yeah, that turned out to be right. And they would introduce many cars into the neighborhood, cause gridlock, traffic, all of which would impact ambulances, fire trucks, buses, and delivery vehicles, among others. We had meetings with Rodriguez, but he didn't want to listen. I guess what that means is that we are going to get a lot of new buildings, and then we're going to find out what happens. So right now, new construction happening now in 2024, residential buildings are blue. A couple of schools and a couple of playgrounds, the construction here, and the Inwood Nature Center. More construction is in the pipeline. I tried to do a little math. I looked at all of the websites of all the buildings, added up all of the units. Buildings under construction now add up to about 2,200 residential units currently under construction. If the census says that there are 2.5 people on average in a household, I guess that means there's 5,500 new residents. That's 10, 12% new people. And it will only get bigger. Let's take a look at some of the buildings. 55 Broadway between 250 and 260. This is a hole in the ground now, so this is just a artist version of it. It's just a hole in the ground. But it's plans to have 60 units, 15 affordable, 11 stories. It's not at the side of the arch. The arch is up the street a little bit. 112 Seaman Avenue is almost complete. 27 units and a backyard, they say. The Eliza at 4790 Broadway, 174 units, 100% at whatever affordable rents are. They're supposed to be that. This is where the new New York Public Library branch will be. So one of these ground floor, two stories. Part of that is the library. Probably that. Yeah, where it says New York Public Library. So that's a new library. I've seen photos on Facebook that the books are being put onto shelves now, so that should actually be opening soon. Next to it, at 4778 Broadway, 80 units, 12 stories. That's the car wash site. Thanks. One of the gigantic buildings, although not the biggest, on 207th Street. That's a totally transformed place now. 207 units with commercial space and parking, 18 stories. This is on the east side, or the north side of 207th Street. So that's a transit yard right behind it. .407 West 206th Street goes around the block to the other side to 207th. This is gigantic, 698 units. That's the Pathmark parking lot, and that's Pathmark. And what was behind it? More stuff that they tore down. Yeah, the old site of the Miramar Pool. Also on 207th Street, behind the North Cove, this is the North Cove here. They gave you some birds here just to give you the idea. Yeah, where the Birdman was. 611 units, all affordable. This is right next to the bridge. This car is coming down off the 207th Street Bridge. 4650 Broadway at Sherman Plaza. This was one of the first proposed. It's almost completed now. Yeah, kind of looks like Miami, Cole says. This is where the old Jewish Memorial Hospital was, the second Jewish Memorial Hospital, not the one on Dyckman Street. This was at Sherman Avenue. Oh, actually at Nagel, closer to Nagel. I'll show you a picture later, yeah. Unless I could be wrong, so we'll look at it. And this is the corner of 212th Street, a shelter for men that's being built. This is 10th Avenue. So this is being constructed by the Bowery Residence Committee. And it's just 4 stories. This is a shelter that's supposedly transitional housing. So this is like the last step before independent living. This is for people who have gone through their substance abuse and they're coming out the other side, and now they're looking for work, and they need a place to live. So what's interesting about it is this is on the site of an old cemetery for the enslaved in Upper Manhattan. And the main entrance, the entrance to the shelter is here. This is an entrance to a memorial. The builder of the site has cut off a corner and dedicated, I don't know how many square feet, for open air reburial of remains of the enslaved people who were removed in 1903 and taken to the Museum of Natural History. Their remains have been at the Museum of Natural History for over 100 years. And so this is a memorial space for contemplation and a reburial place for remains of enslaved Inwoodites from the 1700s. So this is still a few years away from being done. And this is, we'll see. I'm hopeful. A school in the abandoned Hearst House, the scaffolding is down now. This is going to be a preschool, a charter preschool. It looks like it's being gutted. I looked in there yesterday, Cole, the stairway was gone. It's going to be more modern inside. An elevator, yeah. A few projects are on hold. The Holy Trinity site was, I forgot to put the site on it. This is just recent. The design for a controversial new building was rejected Wednesday. That was just this year, I think. Yeah, Seaman and Cumming. At the corner of Seaman and Cumming. The infamous neighborhood, infamous intersection. So who knows what this is going to look like. Right now, there's nothing happening. Yeah, there's still rock there, right? Yeah. The Zeta Charter School opened east of Broadway on 219th Street. There probably needs, if we're going to have a lot more residents, we're probably going to need more schools. This is one. Hopefully there'll be more. It's a big school. I was unable to find out its capacity or if it's full. PS MS 278, which was near that on 219th Street or 220th Street, is moving into this new building on 202nd Street soon, maybe next year. It's 6 stories tall. A couple of playgrounds. This is at the foot of Fort George Hill on Dyckman Street. It used to be just a few benches. Now it's going to be a full-fledged playground opposite the Dyckman houses. So that's being built. Restrooms are going into the Monsignor Kett playground. That's always good. And the Nature Center may be about to open. It closed in it was damaged by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and it has not been open since. So everyone's excited, or I'm excited, to see what's in store. It looks beautiful. So as we finish up our talk, let's just take a look at what we've seen. The first huge development, actually the first development in the 1800s was here, on top of Inwood Hill. In the 1910s and 20s, after the one train arrived, the development was mostly between Broadway and 10th Avenue or Nagle. After the A train arrived, the development was mostly west of Broadway. And then in this the biggest building boom since the 1930s, most of the new development, or maybe the future development, is probably going to be on this old industrial space that is now becoming residential. These are generalizations, of course, because we've seen plenty of exceptions down here and along Broadway, but we'll see. Yeah, what's going on here? There are this Inwood waterfront site, one of the last biggest pieces of New York City-owned land, is a parking lot now, and it's fenced off and it's empty. So that could be, it was proposed as a 540-unit, all affordable, and plus a green space and a STEM facility, which might mean a school. But everything is so preliminary, there's nothing that I could find out about it beyond that. But if you know something, let me know. And right across 218th Street on the northeast corner, that parking garage was leveled, and now it looks like it's ready to be sold to a developer. Maybe Columbia bought it. That's the rumor. We can see Columbia's building here and their soccer field. That would make sense. Finally, this might happen someday, maybe in 2025. Dyckman Farmhouse needs a new roof and a lot of other things. So there's a proposal to rebuild the addition that had been torn down in 1915 and use it as office space so that more of the museum is available as a museum. And also, the steps to the Dyckman Farmhouse are very, very steep, and to add another main entrance on 204th Street that is accessible for those who can't do stairs. So let's hope for that. So there's good development and bad development, and or maybe it's just development. It's all debatable. Yeah, right. And so we will leave it at that tonight. Thanks for coming.